director today is Allyson Beall King. She's an associate professor, the outgoing associate director of undergraduate programs, and incoming director of the School of the Environment at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. So in 2018, she was the co-chair of the ISDS conference in Iceland. Next year, she will also be the co-chair for the conference in Chicago. Her system dynamics work has focused on participatory modeling of water supply and growing demand in both groundwater systems and surface groundwater systems. She works with people seeking for long-term solutions to unsustainable use in areas experiencing growth in a changing hydrologic climate. Interestingly, in the last several years, her focus has shifted towards systems education in support of Gen Z. Allyson teaches courses in system dynamics, environmental assessment, and environmental dispute resolution. And last year, she co-designed a course on environmental justice with 2 seniors and then taught the course during fall of 2021. So today she's gonna tell us all about environmental justice. Allyson, the stage is yours.
I don't know if I'm going to tell you all about environmental justice. I'm going to tell you what I've learned from my students. So it's sort of an interesting, this is sort of a reflective thing. Let's see if I can get this rolling. I can see it.
Yep, and would you make it full size? Yeah, there you go.
Okay. All right. So Ruby's sort of been poking me about this, and it's been an interesting, I just call it a learning journey that I went through on this issue of environmental justice. I mean, it's always been, I think, forefront in my mind, but I hadn't thought very deeply about it until I had these 2 seniors say, we have to have a course in this, we're going to design it. And I'm like, well, who's going to teach it? And they're like, well, I don't know, find somebody to teach it. I'm like, we don't have any experts in this, in our unit to do it. They didn't understand the whole thing about how you get people to teach courses at a university and what this means to people. But then I was, after a bit of arm twisting, I'm like, okay, I will do this. But sort of this is with the caveat that 3 white people of privilege sort of thought about this course, but I think it was a good exercise for all of us to do. And it was sort of an interesting thinking exercise for me. But it was also learning more about Gen Z. So I've now had 3 generations in my classrooms and paying attention to these shifts in how they think and what they think about, I find pretty fascinating. So I'll tell you a little bit about what I've sort of learned there. But most of you probably know this. Who are Gen Z? They were basically born after 96. They tend to be more racially and ethnically diverse. In fact, by 2026, according to Pew, it will be a majority non-white. So with Hispanics sort of gaining more of the population. They're the best educated generation thus far. They're digital natives, so they don't know what it doesn't, they just don't know what it's like without computers. And they tend to be sort of progressive, pro-government. They see diversity as a good thing. And so this is coming just out of the literature and the research that people have been watching there. But thinking about it in a different way, I was like, well, who are these people and what are they going to do for us? I mean, right now, 42% of the global population is under 24. And as I encourage students to vote and say boomers are losing their power quickly because we're dying off. But I like this sort of these notes from Margaret Mead. So we're on the verge of developing a new kind of culture. In this culture, the child, not the parent or grandparent, that represents what could be, what is to come. And without decisive action, environmental degradation will soon make our planet uninhabitable, yet the elderly are no longer the custodians of wisdom. And noted then, if the climate strike youth and their allies are to save humanity and vital ecosystems, prepare for changes in power dynamics beyond what we've ever seen. And so I sort of with this in mind and thinking about who's in my classroom and trying to empower them to take themselves into policy, take themselves into politics, take themselves into being changers of the dynamics we have now. This really struck me as something that we're going to see this huge shift just because of population dynamics. And so the structure of the system is going to change dramatically. And it just makes me think very differently about this generation of students. Just, oh, come on. What I've seen in my classroom, and this now they're full Gen Zs in my classroom. And I've noticed, I mean, certainly the millennials were pretty collaborative. Comparing to Gen Z is much more empowered to take care of self. I mean, I have students saying, I can't do this today because I need to take care of my mental health. And they're not afraid to say any of these things. And I think it's important because they've got so much stress, and I certainly, respect if they need to have mental health days or whatever. But it's just an interesting shift in how they perceive the importance of this openly. They certainly have a desire to connect, and it's not just with their social media, but in the classroom. I think building relationships has become, I think of the three generations I've taught now, the desire to connect with instructors and each other, I think, is at a height. The other thing that I notice is that they're kind, caring, and compassionate. We were teaching a class in dispute resolution, and we're doing a bunch of role playing. And, they're just so nice to each other. We've got people in disputes about water or something important like this. And they're just like, no, we're going to figure this out. We're all going to, everybody's going to get what they need. Whereas, the competitiveness of like the Gen Xers would never have allowed that to happen in the classroom. So it's a real interesting shift. So why did I take on this course? I still think I was kind of crazy for doing it, but I had these two seniors that just insisted we had to do this. And they're right. In a School of the Environment, we should have an environmental justice course or several. So in the process of doing this, I was teaching my seniors how you build a course, and they were just piling on content, so much so, and they thought that these students should be reading far more than they would ever read. I'm like, you would have never read that much. And they're like, you're right, but they should. So it was kind of a funny thing. So when I put them in the instructor role, all of a sudden they thought students should be doing a lot more. But anyway, it was just a journey for myself. And I taught it, excuse me, as a special topics course, because I'm still not 100% on the syllabus that I want for this course. But, and I had a small class. We were just first time back on campus after a year and a half of being distanced. My students were exhausted and freaked out about being on campus and getting sick and this sort of thing. So it was a very strange social dynamic that I went through with these 15 students. And certainly approaching this from a systems perspective and trying to have them say, look, where are these leverage points that we can intervene? Because I believe as somebody who's trying to empower students that we need to look to the positive. And this is a pretty dark subject, as you all know. And then trying to help them understand and help myself understand how legacy injustices sort of create this wicked problems that we're dealing with, and that new injustices are certainly based on these legacy issues. So as I started thinking through it and looking to the literature, I started thinking about, what is the definition? And Robert Bullard is certainly a pillar in this community. And he defines it as the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of environment and public health laws and regulations. And I agree with this, but it sort of left me wanting to think about this a bit more deeply. And I came across this, What is Critical Environmental Justice by David Pellow, who had these 4 pillars. And as we went through the semester, these resonated with us more and more as we went along. And my students were trying to sort of define what this was. And he had these 4 pillars that resonated with us. And the first one was to recognize that social inequality and oppression of all forms intersect. And that actors in the more than human world are subjects of oppression as well. So talking about different species and how we just treat the planet, or how even we treat ecosystems, I think was resonating here for me. And that sort of thinking about those who tend to be oppressive against one faction of the planet tend to be oppressive against others. Let's shift again. The second pillar was scale matters. And this really sort of gets at both spatial and temporal dimensions, and helping me think through then the behaviors that people have. So the structure of the current system based on how we've developed as societies, and where people have felt oppressed, and how it changes how they behave and how other people behave towards them. It's obviously very ingrained in the structures of our societies. And also then thinking about sort of, even he was talking about sort of even at the cellular level, how harms can create injustices over time. The third pillar was this idea that racism and speciesism are just deeply embedded in society. So it's the structure of how our society operates. And he was arguing that the current social order stands as an obstacle to social environmental justice, and really was encouraging people to think about direct grassroots democracy and what that might look like. And rather than saying we're just going to take and change a policy at the high level, he was arguing that it would always be problematic because it's the structure of the system that's been built upon racism. And then the fourth pillar is that both humans and more than humans, not as expendable, which is how we tend to treat others in a lot of ways, that we're not expendable, but as indispensable to our collective future. And so this is, I like the way you use this term, humans and more than humans. So that's the more than humans was everything ecologically around us. That nothing, we can't just say that somebody's expendable. And we certainly have done that in this country and continue to do it in a lot of ways. And I tried then to think about with my students, where were the roots of racism? And I found this Manettian article rather interesting, and because they're arguing that it's usually advanced on the basis of peace, security, social harmony, and order, sometimes on the basis of purity, religion, or otherwise. And there was a lot of parts of this article that I thought actually resonated, but this kind of bugs me and continues to bug me. And I would like to have a conversation about this. But we certainly have done this, saying, well, it's going to be better if we intern the Japanese, or we're religiously segregated in Ireland, or sex segregation in Saudi Arabia, caste in India. But it's always the people of power sort of imposing this on others, and maybe they're justifying it on the basis of peace or security or purity or something like that. But it certainly doesn't justify whether it's right or not. And so sort of through this, I was working with my students, sort of going through a variety of topics each week. And then I started getting them to think about these things in a systems diagram. And so we did this causal exercise sort of every couple weeks and tried to add to it. And as we were talking about segregation, we sort of came up with this exclusionary zoning. So this was their ideas that I then built into Stella as we were going along. And the one thing that I did really like from Manettian is that this idea that there's either people who want to build community around a single primary salient identity, and those who want to live in diverse pluralistic communities. And it just sort of seems people are one way or the other. And this is where my students sort of came up with this. As we have a growing population, you're either going to have a diverse society or segregated society. However, segregated societies do things like promote exclusionary zoning, which just in of itself can impact the wealth gap. And so you end up with this reinforcing loop here. So we talked a lot about issues in cities at this point in time. The other thing that we thought about was this issue of settler colonialism. And this is where I think, thinking to what Manettian was saying, that we've done this in the idea of peace. I think maybe those in power have done it through the idea of peace, but we certainly didn't do that in this country. When we came to this country, we basically tried to erase the native population, which was diverse and extensive. And it was extensive farming. But we came to this with the idea of, we're going to build this nation and we're going to take this land. And it certainly wasn't done in peace. It was done out of simple oppression. And I really encourage people that this Dina Hillier Whitaker, As Long as Grass Grows, is an amazing book. There's several YouTubes that she's got as well, but I really encourage people to look to her. She's a Native American and a lawyer, and sort of talks about the structural system that this country was built on, that basically tried to make all of these people invisible. We also had a speaker last year that talked about, oh gosh, it just went out of my mind, his name. This is horrible. It'll come to me. Talked about the sort of the great dying, and when we came to this country and all the things that happened. But then he also pointed out that this happens to peoples, it's happened historically to peoples, and that the native population now in this country is larger than the Jewish population. So I thought was pretty interesting. So people are recovering, and tribal people are still here, even though we've sort of, as a society, said, you're invisible, you're no longer with us. Just it's sort of an aside that I came across, another really interesting book, Earth System Impacts, or this was just an article of European arrival and the Great Dying in the Americas, that we had this virgin soil epidemics, certainly smallpox, measles, plagues came through. And after European arrival in 1492, it led to about 56 million deaths, which was 90% of the population. So when we came into this land, then people saw it was empty, and therefore, we can just do what we want with it. He did a bunch of population modeling with some pre-Columbian numbers and looking at changes in ecosystems based on the fact that they were no longer being farmed. And just as a sort of a concept, in World War II, 80 million people died. So it was a significant number in the Americas that died of these diseases. Interestingly enough, it changed Earth's systems, because we had this large population reduction, which led to reforestation and changed the entire Earth system and the concentrations of CO2. So the law dome, this is increasing concentrations in the law dome and the WAIS divide. And then here is atmospheric, a proxy for atmospheric CO2. It was in a major decline. So this change really had a huge impact on the entire Earth system. So sort of back to my classroom. Throughout the semester, we talked about things from education equity, corporate diversity, globalization, climate equity, water equity, food equity, healthcare, wildfire impacts, which certainly in the West are disproportionately impact people of color and low income. And so sort of thinking through all of this, and I really admired Richard's walking out of system diagrams, but I didn't do that. So I'm just going to throw a big one at us. My students, so in thinking about all of these things, like for example, education, where you've got this reinforcing loop of increasing education, increases earning capacity and individual financial resources. So these are the things that they put together. And they were seeing this, reinforcing loops. If you have more individual financial resources, you can get better healthcare, better food security, safer housing, which reduces health issues. And as we kept building this and getting sort of more complicated, as we talked about climate, they were certainly thinking about disaster impact and how it may increased vulnerability. Disaster response is not equal, that it tends to benefit higher income communities, which then increase economic and environmental resilience in those communities, not in communities of color. But the thing that sort of struck me with when we kept building this out is, this obvious focus on individual financial resources. So they were really thinking about this from an individual standpoint. And as I was kind of wrapping this up with them at the end of the semester, I'm like, what should be in the center of this? And is it the individual? And they all sort of looked around, and finally somebody said, no, we're talking about this problem here with business as usual capitalism and accumulation of wealth. The one thing they wanted center to this was accountability. So I thought that was an interesting sort of shift. And then we needed another semester, I think, to kind of shift this direction of this causal diagram to focus more on how changes could have happened here. But they certainly were extremely tuned into what these impacts are on the individual. And I guess I should say a little bit that I had a very diverse class as well. And I had students that came from very low income or first gen students, as well as people who lived relative lives of privilege. So, but again, this was a group model, and they all agreed on what it was looking like. So I sort of thought that interesting. Then trying to think about, how we move forward. So trying to get them to think more positively. I was like, should we use activism? What can you do if you're doing it at the grassroots level? Or should we try to do this with regulation, which Pello would argue against because it's part of the state is part of the problem. We certainly all agreed on recognizing the systemness and the connection of everybody. And the other thing that we found, and this is another sort of diversion that I came across, was integrating native science. And we spent actually a couple weeks thinking about this because of the different way that Indigenous people thought about it. And I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. I'll just there's some resources here that I found pretty fascinating. But Indigenous knowledge is unique and different from Western science. And it's basically thinking about systems, and all of the things that we try to think about is certainly holistic, that all beings in nature are interconnected and people can't separate themselves from the natural world. It's local, sort of because it's based on the location of where people are and what they needed to survive. It had to do with active learning, so gained through direct interaction with the natural environment, and the personal value to ensure that all forms of life are living in harmony with nature and the spiritual world. And this is sort of the pathway that this has now taken me. So I've sort of diverted off in my own mind and trying to think about what is the root or what is the cause of all these injustices, but now thinking more on the solutions line. This really started resonating with me. And I would really encourage, and I tried to pull it should be Gregory Kaheti, a little pieces of their YouTubes to show, but I couldn't get a small enough chunk to make it reasonable. But Gregory Kaheti and Leroy Littlebear, I really encourage you to sort of go listen to some YouTubes or this. I'm just starting to get through this book, Native Science, The Natural Laws of Interdependence by Kaheti, that really sort of fundamentally shift how we think about things, but it's so related to the things that we think about in systems thinking, system dynamics. I just think we should try to explore this more. I wished I'd had more time till I got to the point today that I could talk more to this, but it's a very interesting shift in how to think about things. And I think as system thinkers, that this is something that we should look at. So sort of back to my Gen Zers. Now I've got stuff I can't see. If we think about, are they up to the challenge? This is a different generation. There's going to be more of them, very shortly. If they vote, they're going to start overwhelming how our elections work. But if we just think about this in sort of, are they up to dealing with recognition that social inequality and oppression in all forms intersect? Are they up to it? And I argue that they are, because I've just found, if we'll do this, that this idea for collaboration and kindness seems to be, at least with my students, now, again, they're self-selecting into my classrooms, they believe in collaboration and kindness. It's just part of who they are. This competitiveness is not there that I used to see. Back to sort of this issue of scale and understanding how all things are connected, both spatially and temporally. And I would argue that because they seem to want to connect, and it's well beyond social media, but social media is powerful. And I can talk about a little project that one of my groups did for their final project on a TikTok video, which I was like, what? But it made a connection, and it was done with intention that I found was not only creative, but very thoughtful. This idea that humans and non-humans are indispensable. You know, we can't just say we're not going to have this group of people, we're not going to have that type of ecosystems. And I would argue that they're up to it, again, because, oops, I went to the wrong one. I'll go back, change my thing. This issue of social inequality are deeply embedded in society. But then it goes back, I go back to this quote that if climate strike youth and their allies are to save humanity, prepare for changes in power dynamics beyond what we've ever seen. So as these young people come into power and become empowered, we're going to see a very different approach to problem solving, I believe. Then back to this issue that humans and non-humans are indispensable. I think that because this group embraces diversity, that they will be able to think about the importance of all beings in a more diverse way. Wait, that's all I had here because I don't like talking a lot, but I'm just curious what people think. Maybe I'll hit escape, stop sharing. Anyway, it was just an adventure that I went down and thought, because it's so system related, that it's worth a conversation. And in all honesty, I mean, system dynamics is now focusing on equity and justice issues, but I haven't followed enough of those papers yet. I want to, but I just haven't gotten there yet. So this was my own journey. By arm twisting by two seniors.
Thank you, Allyson. It's very interesting. So I'm wondering, like, yeah, I know you don't want to take on more classes, but what's next, right? So after this special topic class, is there a part 2 where? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah,
there. Well, I've got another professor at our Vancouver campus who's actually got more expertise in this than I do. And I think she may take the course. I'm going to hand her all the materials and maybe let her develop it, because I don't have the bandwidth in the next 4 years to teach very much. So we'll see where she takes it. And I think it's just an interesting exploration in how people think about this and how people think about empowering young people to think about it.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm guessing, like understanding the system interdependence and then making individual choices could be two separate things.
Sure.
So what's the link, or what's the missing piece? Because if we say EV is a solution to, one of the top solutions to lower the carbon emission, And then we have to think about where do we get all the cobalt and other materials to feed into the batteries or the traction motors. And then are we, willing to sacrifice Idaho, cobalt resources for the cobalt, or we just keep mining the Congo? And again, the not in my backyard mentality, it's all really complicated. And to what extent, like it's always makes me wondering, like, right, we know maybe EV is the solution, but not a lot of adoption. There's a reason for it, economic reasons.
Yeah.
But anything becomes mass adoption always have consequences too. Lately, I've read some articles on objections for large scale solar plants. So when you have solar panels on your rooftop and other things, it's fine. But once you talk about 2,000 acres and things like that, then whoa, it's a big deal in the community, and now it affects land value and other things, and then the environmental justice and equality then is a big issue. And so I can see that at the Department of Energy, we're trying to look into this, but again, it's something very hard to quantify, especially when you try to anticipate what's the potential impact and who will be impacted.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And it's just, it's a shifting the burden type model, I think, that people who are screaming about the ugliness of solar or something, or wind power, are not sitting next to the coal fire plant, because we've already segregated that population around the coal fire plant and we don't care about them. We've sort of erased that impact from our minds. But I think sort of justifying the expense, and I'm on a committee for a woman who's doing a waste to jet fuels model. And they've her committee now is like, yes, jet fuel is more expensive, and it should be, because we're taking the problem of another industry and solving their problem for them out of municipal waste. So I think we just have to figure out how to think about this differently. And just an aside on, on lithium mining, one of my students in this class, they all had to do final projects, but looked at the impacts of Thacker Pass, which is through, and I don't think litigation is going to stop it. So for those of you who don't know, Thacker Pass is in northern Nevada, out in the desert. We'll probably de-water everything for, hundreds of miles around them. But even disturbing the soil, there's so much arsenic and antimony in the soil just because of the natural geologic development of that basin, that even just driving around on it's going to put this stuff into the atmosphere, and wherever the wind's blowing, it's going to impact those people. So I don't know. That whole issue it's a pretty major problem. It just requires us to think about things differently.
So these Gen Z students, you must have a very good collection of them there. I mean, I really liked the approach and the students, pushing for this course. I'm just wondering, there's got to be Gen Z people in Idaho, the most conservative state, except for South Carolina, maybe, right next door to you. Yeah. Maybe they don't go to college. I mean, what's going to happen? I mean, I would like to believe that all these this Gen Z is going to make the world a better place, and I hope they do. But do you think that you're missing, or you, or the group is missing something there?
Oh,
that,
I'm sure, and it's sort of,
will it be that easy?
How do they prioritize one over another? And we got a lot of deer in the headlights, just like, we don't know. And admittedly, my students have self-selected. I mean, they're environmental science students, right? So they're grappling with these things anyway, but they argue that it's ubiquitous on social media. Everybody knows there's a big problem. And Idaho's choice, I think, is yes, to not educate students. That's sort of their choice. We put blocks up for education everywhere. And there was, there's these radicals trying to shut down universities because we teach people to think.
Yeah, that's no good.
But,
Anyway, that was one question I had.
yeah,
So, I mean, and what there, so you're probably dealing with a special subgroup, but they may be aware of what the problems are, presumably, even with the people who are not in their
right.
group, their whatever that is, where you all think alike, your sub area. Another thing I just was wondering about in that model, that diagram, and I come across this a lot, so that you have individual financial resources. But in this case, in a lot of other cases, it's really not the average financial resources that we're interested in. I'm sort of wondering how you deal with that, because it's really, you have a divergence of gradually you get a group that has a lot more financial resources and another group has less. So the average doesn't really tell us very much. I mean, in the model, the things that affect it are one thing, but if you went to a quantified model, I mean, not that you're doing that, but I'm just wondering, how do you handle that? Or is it that system dynamics is not really appropriate for that? It's more, where you have agent-based and you'd have some people, gradually you'd get a separation of different subgroups that have fewer financial resources, and then they're stuck in certain loops, and the people who have more and have enough money that they don't do anything and they keep making money, like some of us who are retired have. So I mean, that does happen, and people get into that, and that's their normal life, and they don't understand why other people can't provide for themselves.
Right. I mean, there are, I don't think average isn't, I don't think average is in there. I think it was individual financial resources.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a single thing in the model, but there's really, what I'm thinking is that sort of, you sort of, in the real world, you have these divergent groups evolve. Well, I don't know the answer to that. I'm just sort of something I thought about.
Right. Well, they have evolved, and they're structurally designed right now. And was it Wharton? Maybe it was Wharton. They polled a bunch of students in the business school. What is the average income in the US? And a lot of people thought it was either over 100,000 or even 800,000. The average.
Average, not the median.
Segregated, right? How segregated people are. And a lot of it has to do with, how they were raised. And if you were raised in wealth, you don't understand, all of these things that, like redlining, that sort of started this whole major inequality in our country. You wouldn't understand it if you were on the right side of the red line.
Yeah, well, also the difference between the median and the mean. Yeah. And for income in the US, that's an important distinction. Because it's really the median, half the people are below. And when you see what the median is, it's pretty darn low.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends whether you're talking about individual or family of four or whatever. So it gets confused. But I don't think even people who think about that realize how low it is.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question on the model?
Sure.
So do you ever include, so when I try to do the models in class, so I teach sustainability studies to undergrads, and we do very, big picture general models. And we talk about, how here we a lot in the Western nations commoditize nature versus look at it as a relative, like the Maori, like in New Zealand, that gave rivers rights, same people. And so do you ever include mental models? Because I find that is helpful to kind of just add in where the beliefs are that support those structures, because that might be a potential avenue to a solution. It's a slow solution to try to change mental models, but they're trying to do that a lot in animal conservation with social and behavioral change. Did they talk about like sometimes you can somewhat measure that in some communities through survey research and stuff like that? I was just curious if they looked at that as an opportunity.
I think they recognized it, and they certainly that the sort of the have and the have-nots issues, and I think they understand that the structure of the system has created that. But and I think that they tend to think that through sort of connectedness, I'm sort of speculating here, but you can get people to understand things better. So for an example, there's a large lake to the north of us, Lake Coeur d'Alene, that has 1 million plus tons of mining waste in the bottom of the lake. And now we've got nutrients coming in, and eutrophication's happening, and there's a possibility to potential that we're mobilizing metals due to this. And they wanted to see if they could help the tribe by letting people in their age cohort understand it better. And they made several TikToks, and they were just little examples, but they started getting a bunch of hits. And it was just to say in this simple 15-second thing that I don't understand. But that's sort of how they think about changing mental models, is getting people to think about it through creativity. And at least, some of them were thinking that way. But I think you're right, trying to include something like that in here. And I didn't do much kibitzing with them. I just said, draw this out. And so they just do these messy drawings, and then I would take them home and try to turn them into something more legible for us. But, and maybe with a little more time, they would have thought that through as well. And
to Marcella's point, though, mental models are at the bottom of the iceberg model, which the systems people talk about all the time. And Meadows said, transcending paradigms was the greatest lever for change. And the mental models are in fact paradigms that we operate under most of the time, not making the mental models explicit, though more often than not, we use arguments to defend the positions that we want to take that we don't believe are defensible. Right? In other words, all of the stuff about racism, I find all these people talk about these reasons for doing segregation, but they don't want to simply talk about the fact that they're afraid.
Right.
Right. So attempting to uncover and making explicit the mental models or the paradigms, which are actually the foundation for why things were constructed the way they were, is the real leverage point, if you can get there. Though the difficulty is people protect their mental models unbelievably well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to like the Department of Energy, you were talking about the EVs and stuff, like in class, one of the things we try to uncover, like I try to get the students to uncover, is like, like, do they recognize that they kind of expect energy on demand? Where did this come from? How did the structure develop? And we look at a lot of the policies, and a lot of them don't contain money for conservation initiatives. Like in terms of getting people to use less, like a big solution would be getting rid of that vampire energy, getting people throw on a sweater, turn off the heat a little bit. But there's not a lot of, I never see money for that or money for initiatives for that, even though we have better social psychology research on how to do that now. I mean, that was just something I might not not be aware of what's going on with that. But like in terms of trying to reduce energy usage, that might be something more to explore. I'm surprised that I see lack of that out there. But I also wanted to mention, I find your class really fascinating, Allison, and I wish I could have sat in on it.
Yeah, so Michaela, quick response to you. From a DOE standpoint for research, then we have, energy efficiency type of research. But I think what you mentioned further is, how we study the behavior of people and how we can encourage them to conserve energy. That's another social aspect we need to consider. And then Allyson, Andrew has two questions for you. Andrew, you want to speak up?
Oh, sure. My first was this, well, they're kind of, I don't know. Anyways, so my first thought was about the, so I've encountered challenges from students as well as just from other progressive activists, where there seems to be a fear that if I embrace your justice issue, somehow I'm neglecting my justice issue, and that even though they're interrelated, they're not interdependent in the way that like solving all of them at the same time is sort of the only real way to solve them. And I was just curious on how your students navigated this, in recognizing the interconnection of things without somehow dismissing the particularities of certain justice issues and concerns. Because I think sometimes I've had students who said, oh, well, racism, sexism, all these are become irrelevant on a dying planet. So the most important justice has to be environmental justice because it sort of is the meta justice. It subsumes them all. But then that sort of dismisses the social issues that people are experiencing in a way that is not usually helpful in getting them on board. It just sort of says, well, then you go hug your trees and don't care about people. And then anyways,
Yeah.
Did you encounter any of that with your students? And
Yeah, I did. But in other classes, sort of this fatalism is where everything's just going to die anyway. I certainly run into that frequently, but also, it's really depressing, and it's no wonder there's so many mental health issues that at least are being honest about now. I mean, I have lots of anxiety about it too, but probably in my age cohort, we don't say, I can't come to work today because I'm freaked out about climate. We just, you have to sort of keep thinking about solutions. And what I try to do with that is shift them to something positive. But these overlapping things, I mean, I think we have to think about it like this new group, that broke off from Climate Interactive on multi-solving, and really focus on that. And then embracing the fact that if we're going to do something new like EVs, we have to think about the impacts, but across the board. So it may be that it creates an injustice in one place, but if it fixes an injustice in another place, I think we can sort of wrangle around that. But sort of your other point about did they get to key leverage points? And I don't think we got to there. I don't think we got there. I
guess my real question is, how would you teach that? How would you help them, teach me how to teach students to move from recognizing the interconnection of things to, and here's how we identify key leverage points for change.
Well, we did talk about, we talked about, the Meadows, scales of where the leverage points are. And there was a lot of thinking. This was a sort of an introspective group too. And there's a lot of times they'd just be sitting there. You could see the wheels were turning, but they weren't saying anything. And so after a few weeks, I figured out, oh, that's just the kind of people they are. And I happen to have like 10 of them in my class that are very introspective, but yeah, multi-solving is, I think, where we've got to get.
Can I jump in?
Please.
I do something similar in my class where we build out a model on a problem. And so we build out the causal model, and then we look at what are current suggested interventions. And then we we build that into the model, where would it fit? And then we follow the flows to see what would happen. And would it sustainably solve the problem? You know, we don't put numbers to it because I don't have that kind of time. So it's more of a conceptual model. But then you can start to see like what we found is like the mental model level, if you could change that paradigm, they can see that the whole flow changes, everything changes, the whole system. But if you like enforcement, it can in the short term decrease what's happening, but in the long term, it could also increase because of demand and supply changes. So I found that helpful because all of a sudden it's all this information visually, and then we just follow the flows. Let's put the arrow in where the solution have an impact and follow the flow. So I don't know if that's helpful, but
Yeah, I think it absolutely would be. We just didn't get to that point with this group of students. Like, thank you for that note, Andrew. Yes. So this is where the contrast and what little I've sort of delved into it on sort of native science shifts this whole thing. And it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting pathway. At least I'm going to follow it for a while now that I've sort of gotten myself on it. But I think it's an interesting pathway to think about for a paradigm change, that if we shift to thinking that we're all connected through the fact that we're sitting on this planet and connected through spirit as well. Leroy Little Bear refers to it as surfing the flux. And just an very different way of thinking about how we should operate. So if anything came out for me from this class, my big takeaway is I need to go down that pathway now. So it's a new way to think about things.
I'm also curious, Allyson, like the relationship between individual action and addressing systems challenges in multi-solving. So were your students able to think in terms of we need to change systems, or did they always, my students have a tendency to want to revert back to, okay, so what am I supposed to do about straws and waste? And how am I supposed to change my personal day-to-day life? And then because I can't change the system, I'm just an individual. Did you have that sort of dynamic in your classroom, or?
I do in sort of all of my classes where they're struggling with this. And I've got a PhD student about to finish up who's been looking at even, very small stream restorations and the impact on biodiversity, because we have these global level things versus these very local things. And I think we just have to keep somehow keeping the tension between global and local, and figuring out that little changes actually can do things. And there's a lot of literature on this, when we see big social movements, when we saw, what resulted in the Voting Rights Acts going through. I mean, all of a sudden you might go from thinking it's just a little grassroots thing to it gets just enough forward momentum that it becomes a watershed moment. I think we see changes throughout our history that have been like that. So I try to pull my students back into that frame of reference.
All right, thank you, Allyson, so much for sharing your journey with Gen Z and environmental justice issues with us. So we'll meet again April 20th, and Lena Martinez, she's a graduate student at WSU. She will present on her work about plastic recycling.
Good. Yeah, we just had a little Are You Ready to Defend meeting yesterday, and seeing the change in how her major advisors were thinking about this, I was like, wow, that's really cool. You got them thinking in this way. So yeah, Lena's great. So I'm glad she'll be presenting. It'll be good practice for her defense. So good.
All right. See you next month.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye, all.
Bye. Sure, Marcella.
oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't want to take up other people's time, but yeah, if that would be okay, because I'm trying to do something similar in different classes that you're doing, and I'd just love to have someone to talk to about.
Oh yeah. Happy.
Got it.
So where do you teach?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. It's a small liberal arts college. So they have a
uh-huh.
sustainability studies minor program. So I teach
Uh-huh.
in that program.
Yeah, I want to enroll in Allison's school. I might learn something if I go there. Sounds like a great program. You're doing a lot of interesting things.
We're trying. We'll see.
Yeah.
See where
If-
things.
Alrighty.
So is your email at what, or can I just grab your email? Should I just email you to set up a time, or? Like, I imagine you're really busy though. I saw something about you're going to be heading the program.
Director. Yeah. Right now I'm trying to finish up 2 classes, 4 of my own students, Lena. And this week, what am I doing? Undergrad scholarships. I'm like, how did this end up on my lap? And I have no idea what I'm doing. So
Oh, when would be
You
probably-
seem to be doing quite well and doing nothing. Not knowing what you're doing very
Yep.
well.
with scholarships, I don't know. Giving away.
Is
Hey, I'm
sometime
gonna-
better than others? Should I wait till like summer to try to contact you, or?
It might be, yeah. See you, Richard. Yeah, I mean, right now is our spring break, so we're on semester system, so we're done the end of April.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So we finished May. So maybe I'll touch base with you at the end of April. That'd be,
Yeah, that'd be
wouldn't
great.
mind. I'd
Love
really
to-
appreciate it. 'cause
Love
I'm
to
still
chat about it. And
thrilled.
also my former PhD student, Jen Johnson, had done a bunch of this stuff in education. And
Yeah, I talked to her a lot. She was
Okay.
helpful.
yeah,
She's off. She's at a director now at a natural resource
yeah,
organization.
Washington Natural Resource for Island County. So she's out in the Puget Sound.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
All right,
Okay.
nice talking. Bye.
Bye.